Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Devlon Ford from the Noble Research Institute, and we are going to be talking about grazing, but more specifically, we are going to be talking about some mistakes that producers make that are really impacting their profitability. So Devlon is very experienced in helping producers create grazing plans that work for their unique operations and improve their bottom line. So he has a lot of expertise and knowledge to share. He's very practical. I learned a lot in this conversation, so I hope you learn a lot too. Now, with that, I do want to remind you that if you are looking for a speaker for your next event, whether that is a workshop, a keynote, panelist, in person or virtual, I am still taking on slots for 2025. So you can message me or contact me via my website and just use the contact me form, and that goes straight to my email. But with that, let's talk about grazing.
Does tax season make you want to bang your head against the wall? Is billing a bad word in your household? Does meeting with your ag lender make your blood pressure rise? Stress a little less with cattle management software, Performance Beef. It tracks important feed, financial, and health data all in one system. The results? You can pull inventories, detailed financials, and invoices in minutes. Get ahead for next year's tax season. Visit performancelivestockanalytics.com to learn more.
Alrighty. Well, Devlon, I am excited to have you on the show today and to talk about grazing, because grazing is a topic that I sense that you are passionate about, and I know your coworkers are very passionate about as well, but it's just something that always goes over well on the show and is important for ranchers to always be continuing their education on and maybe brushing up on a few things. So the first thing I always ask guests, and it's maybe not an easy question, but it's sure a fun one to hear responses, is why do you believe in the beef industry?
I enjoy working with livestock, cattle particularly. Got to work cattle with my son and some friends this last weekend for the first time in a long time, and well, it was a good day. I mean, we was working cattle, but it was a good day, enjoyable. I just like being around like-minded people like me that want to take care of their livestock and their land.
Absolutely. And tell us a little bit more about what you're doing today, because you're with the Noble Research Institute, but elaborate a little bit more on your role.
My role is I'm one of the facilitators. I get to travel around a lot of the U.S. teaching courses, primarily our Noble Grazing Essentials course and our Business of Grazing course. Get to visit with a lot of producers. Hopefully when they leave our courses, they've taken something home that, from my past experiences. And typically every time I leave, of course, I've taken home something from them. So I always tell everybody I'm a lifelong learner. I was about 50 when I finally went back and got my master's degree. So as we go to these courses and facilitate these programs, we get the opportunity to learn from those producers as well.
Well, I always like to visit with lifelong learners. That's part of the reason I started the podcast, so that I can continue to be one of those, and for all the other lifelong learners who are constantly wanting to learn something new, hear different perspectives. So when we visited on the phone and we're talking about, what are we going to talk about on this podcast interview, you mentioned that one thing that you either hear producers getting mixed up or that you really focus on in your courses is that difference between carrying capacity and stocking rate, correct?
Correct. I've been several places, and quite often people use those two terms interchangeably. They use them for the same thing, and they're two very distinct terms, definitions, and outcomes on your ranch when used improperly.
Do you want to take some time to elaborate on the two terms individually?
So carrying capacity is based off a mathematical formula. It takes into account grazable acres. It takes into account forage production on those acres, and it also takes into account what utilization, how much you want consumed of that forage that's out there. Typically that's expressed as a percentage. And then on the denominator side, we'll take your livestock weight and multiply it by some intake value. Typically in our classes, just as averages, we'll use like a 2.6% intake per day for that animal. And then, how many ever days we're planning on grazing, we'll multiply it by that and then divide the numerator by the bottom or the denominator. And that will give us the carrying capacity for our ranch, how many head our ranch will support underneath the terms we put in there. Grazable acres, I hear a lot of people say, oh, Granddaddy did it this way and he ran 100 cows and I got the same amount of land. Well, you might have the same amount of land and you may not. In one of our classes at the Grazing Essentials course, we talk about this. We pull up a map that's about 85 acres and 19 years later it's 75 acres. Just because the oil pad came in, the highway moved south, different things happen. So, another thing about it is if you're doing the things your granddaddy did, you're probably running bigger cows than your granddaddy did because not many people's got a lot of 1,000-pound cows anymore like my grandfather did. So the forage availability, that's kind of based on your climate, where you're at. If you're more arid, you're probably going to run less forage than, say, we are here in south central Oklahoma with 38 average inches of rainfall. So, you're only going to be able to grow so much grass, so much forage for those animals. Utilization, how much we take, is one decision as a manager or as an owner that you make in that calculation. You decide what it is that we typically will try to push people to take less than they want to, because I've heard the term, oh, that's wasting grass if I don't eat it. No grass is ever wasted. It's always useful for something somewhere. Even if it's not ran through a cow, it'll improve the soil health in future once it lays on the ground and decays. Those nutrients can go back in the soil. On the bottom side of that equation, we talked about cow weight, and we just tell people, take the average weight of your cow herd. And typically, most people are going to use 1,200-pound cows, and then multiply that by the 2.6% intake. I know back in the 80s when I was still in school, undergrad, we talked 3% back there. Kind of the range is 1.9 to 3.5 for cattle. So somewhere in there, depending on their stage of life cycle they're in, whether they're calving or trying to breed back up, that type of thing, their nutrient requirements is going to be a little bit different on a daily basis. So we just use 2.6 as an average. And then you take that number and multiply it by the days you plan on grazing. If you plan on grazing forages 365 days a year, that's the number you use, 365. If you've got a stocker operation and you're going to be running 120 days, that's the number you use. Once you do all the math, it'll give you a number, and that's the maximum amount of cows that place will carry underneath those conditions. Stocking rate, on the other hand, is solely a management decision. That is the number of animals that we as managers and owners choose to put on our landscapes. That's how many animals we buy or put on that ranch. So it's straight up management decision.
So what are the major implications and problems you see when producers are using those two terms interchangeably instead of understanding them for being two separate things?
Typically what I see happening is when they use them interchangeably, they're not really thinking or paying attention to their ranch. Our ranches will teach us a lot of stuff if we just look at it and monitor it and see what happens over time. But if they're using them interchangeably, typically they have not done the calculation to see if their carrying capacity is where it needs to be. They may be low or they may be high on their stocking rate because they haven't calculated their carrying capacity.
Support your cattle's health and productivity with Vigortone minerals. Since 1912, Vigortone has been a trusted name in animal nutrition. The revitalized product line offers targeted nutrition for every stage of production and every region. Vigortone delivers consistent performance and simplifies your mineral decisions. Wherever you are, Vigortone works. Visit vigortone.com to learn more, and that link is also in the show notes. So when producers are looking to calculate that carrying capacity, I know you just went through what goes into that calculation. Are there other resources in their area that they should turn to kind of get started on that? Or is it pretty much a straightforward calculation across the board no matter where they're at?
Well, the calculation is the same, but the numbers are going to be different depending upon where you're at, your situation, and your numbers will be different than your neighbor ranch's numbers. With the grazable acres, people say, well, I own 1,000 acres. It's a good deal. I'm glad you do. How much of that is grazable? Well, 1,000 acres is. There's no roads on it. There's no barns on it. No lots on it. No houses. Very little brush or woods. So that's where people can get confused there. They figured on how many acres they own, not how many acres an animal can graze on it. Quite often, oil field pads, we have some of those here in South Central Oklahoma. They don't think about those. They don't think about their lots. If you do have brush, which we do have a lot here in the Cross Timbers region, we do have some control over the brush. We can go in and either strategically clear it with dozer or something like that, or, if we're very progressive and have a whole lot of patience, we could bring in some goats or something else that might eat some of that brush. So that's where, the grazable acres, that's where those kind of numbers could come from. Your forage production is one of the hardest numbers for people to come up with. And the way we teach it in class is, if you've got history of the ranch, you probably know, I tell everybody when I was on the ranches every day, I might not tell you how many pounds of forage was out there, but I could tell you how long those set of calves could be in that pasture. So I was still equating it, and I just wasn't thinking about it that way. So, you can visually appraise it and say, I've got 4,000 pounds of dry matter here. You can take a ruler out there and do some measurements, and we've got some methods here at Noble. We've worked with Jim Garish on some our classes, and he's helped us out a bunch, and we've used a lot of his spreadsheets and tricks and things like that, or methods, and we can take that measure and do some measuring out in the pastures, and we come up with that number. Another good way that I tell a lot of people to do it is they can get on the NRCS Web Soil Survey. It's a free website, very good to use for some instances, and it's a good starting place for a lot of things. They can get in there and outline their ranch on that map, and it'll give them an average. You can look at a good year, a bad year, an average year, and I suggest either going at the high end of average year and at the low end or the best end of bad year, because if you use a good year every year, your carrying capacity is going to be too high, because we have 38 inches average rainfall here in Oklahoma, and we might hit that 3 out of 10. So, but that's a good place to get that forage production number just as a base to get started. And then after you've gotten started, you're monitoring your animals, you're monitoring your pastures, you're taking notes, recording down all this information, and that will help you become better the next time you do these calculations. Again, the utilization rate, a lot of people think they need to take 80 to 100% of their forage, and I would disagree with that. We typically talk around, depending upon the type of forage, we're talking about 30% on some native ranges here in Oklahoma. If we're talking the Bermuda grass, we'll be talking a little bit higher than that. If we're talking winter wheat, which we have a lot of, we're talking 60% or so. A lot of those, those annual type grasses, you can sometimes take a little bit more than you can your perennials. But your native perennials, they are made to take a little bit and move on down the road and let that plant grow and recover. The livestock number, I ask a lot of people what their cows weigh, and I get a lot of numbers, and then I ask how many people's got scales. And not a lot of people have scales. So unless you make a living buying cattle and know what a cattle weighs, you might miss your cattle weight a little bit. And then daily intake, you can set it at 2.6, 3%. Either one of those would be fine. If you don't want to be a little bit safer, 3% would be a good average number to use. And then the number of days is, that's dependent on how long you want to graze. If you plan on feeding hay and, energy or protein supplement 60 days, then that number's 305 days. If you've got a lease that runs out in 9 months, you're looking at a 9-month or 270 days, how many every days you're planning on grazing that landscape, where you put that number there. So, like I said, the carrying capacity calculations is some of the hardest math we teach.
Okay, so I really appreciate you walking me through that and the listeners through that and going into more detail there. So we've talked carrying capacity, stocking rate, and before we started this, you also talked about stocking density. So do you want to throw that in there too and share how that's different than the other two terms we just talked about.
Stock density it's basically the amount of pounds or the pounds of animals that you put on a specific spot. Typically, most people are going to be talking 20,000 pounds of stock density, so that'd be 21,000 pound cows on an acre. That's 20,000 pounds of stock density per acre. In our classes, typically the last day on our Grazing Essentials course, we will show our producers what 1,000,000 pounds of stock density look like. So imagine, if you would, about 30 cows in a 50 by 50 fence, 50 foot by 50 foot, 30 cows. We leave them there for 1 hour is all we do. And then we'll open the gate and move them again. Stock density allows us to do a lot of different things, and I'm not telling anybody to go out and do 1,000,000 pounds of stock density. Anywhere north of 60,000 to 100,000 is pretty good. The higher you get, the more intensively you have to manage it. But stock density is one of the best tools in a grazer's toolbox. One of the things that as animals graze around, they're going after what we call the ice cream plants. They're going after what they really want. And if we give them enough time and enough room, that's what they're going to do. But if we put them down into a smaller area, we're going to convince them that they need to eat something, so they probably need to eat whatever they can get a hold of real quick. So you get a lot more uniform grazing distribution that way. You're using more of your forages that they may normally pass over until the second or third time back through there.
Is there an impact on animal performance when you're seeing higher stocking densities in those more intensive systems?
One thing we need to remember when we're talking stock density, we're talking pounds of animals and time. And time is a very critical piece of that. With the higher stock densities, we're putting more nutrient back into the soil, more manure, more urine back into the soil in a smaller area. In other words, they're not able to go a half a mile and loaf at the water and, and spread their manure and urine there around the water or underneath the shade trees. They're putting it on the pasture where it's going to give us the biggest benefit for our operation. The other thing about stock density is it's a tool. We can make those animals eat things that they may not necessarily want to eat. It's not going to hurt them, but they will eat that. They'll still gain weight on those forages. The other thing it'll do is if we have a lot of dry standing forage that for whatever reason we didn't get grazed off, or maybe it's a winter pasture that's already terminated and went to seed, and we can use stock density to lay that forage that's 2 or 3 foot tall that the cattle are, the stems have all lignified. The cattle are not going to eat it. They're going to graze around it. We can use that stock density to then put that taller forage on the ground and get it in closer contact with the soil. So now we're back to feeding the soil, and the soil feeds the grass and the grass feeds your cows. So for years when I was managing cattle for Noble on different ranches, I always thought I was a cattle manager or cowboy, whatever you want to call me. Come to find out, what I've since then learned is I'm more of a grass manager and a soil manager than I am the cattle manager.
I'm hearing more and more people share that perspective or change in thought, if you will, however you want to describe that. So with all of that, when we're thinking about the profitability of ranches and how grazing systems fit into that, what is that profitability impact if producers are putting too many or too few cattle in their pastures and not, understanding those terms correctly and having that plan?
The problem with running more animals or setting our stocking rate above our carrying capacity is we are more than likely going to increase our direct cost of those animals, because we're more than likely going to have to feed more substitutional feeding, feed hay, more protein or more energy. Not to mention what we could potentially do, or what we will be doing once we start overgrazing our ranches. When we overgraze our ranches, we're declining the roots in the soil, we're declining the quality of the soil. on our ranches because there's no forage there to grow. One of the 6 soil health principles is always keep living roots. Well, anytime we take a plant and bite it to the point where we remove too many of the leaves off of it, think of those leaves as a solar panel on your fence charger, and what would happen if you covered up half of those solar cells with tape? The charger wouldn't function like it should. Same way with plants. If we remove too many leaves, that plant cannot perform because it doesn't have any solar, so then it starts pulling carbohydrates up out of the roots, out of the soil, up to the plant for growth. So that's one of the dangers of stocking your ranch above carrying capacity. On the other hand of that, for profitability, when we start, stocking rate is the primary determinant of profitability. Stocking rate is the primary determinant of profitability. If we stock too few of animals on that ranch, then we're probably not going to have enough revenue coming in that we can cover our overhead costs as well. So, we have to think about that too. There's a pretty good curve. The higher the stocking rate, the less production you get with an animal. But there's also, if I'm in a stocker operation, I may choose to, only gain 2 pounds a day and run more animals than I run fewer animals and gain 2.5. So, the stocking rates, that's a pretty fine line. And I typically would recommend people to depend upon their forages, the climate they're in, how arid it is, how wet it is, typically set that stocking rate somewhere between 70, maybe 85%. If certain times, if you're doing some winter pasture, graze out with some yearlings, then, you can run that a little bit higher, but just need to be aware that you may need to be selling those animals a little bit quicker than you thought you would. So, a lot of this just kind of goes back to the context of that producer and their goals for their ranch.
Do you have big ambitions for your operation, but feel like you get so caught up in the day-to-day fires that you are just spinning in circles? You aren't alone. I've been in your shoes and know just how frustrating it can be. That's why I created Move the Ranch Forward. It's a guide for ranchers. This guide is a PDF that contains the exact process my husband and I use to stay focused on our goals throughout the year, even when life throws us curveballs. You can access Move the Ranch Forward today at casualcattleconversations.com. So you've touched a little bit on, when you're talking about stocking density and talked about, some of the cool things you can do with that. And there's a lot of buzz around some of those more intensive grazing strategies. But there are still a lot of producers who moving cattle every day isn't necessarily feasible or doesn't feel feasible depending on their business plan. So what tips do you have for producers like that who want to make sure they're still being good stewards of the land and improving those pastures that they're grazing?
I totally understand that because a couple years ago, me and my wife lived about 45 minutes from where our cattle were. So basically I checked them about every 3 days. So I would come up and I would move my cattle about every 3 days. What we typically tell people in wetter climates like we have here in Oklahoma, once you go in there and start grazing an area, within about 3 to 5 days after you first move in there, there'll be new leaves coming up on that plant. And as those new leaves come up, those are the plants and those are the leaves those animals are going to target because it's fresh growth. We all know that fresh young growth is very palatable, very nutritious, and that's what those animals want. So if we can move them every 3 to 5 days in, a wetter climate, 5 to 7 in more arid climate where the grass grows a little bit slower, we're okay. The later in the year when, we start moving in towards fall, we might be able to extend that a little bit of time in there just because, the plants aren't growing as fast as they are in the, late spring, early summer. So, we have to make this fit our ranch, fit our lifestyle, and just understand what our goals are for our ranch. And if our goals are to improve soil health and we have the ability to move every day, great, get after it. If you only have the ability to move once or twice a week, do the best you can, but always remember there are pros and cons to everything we do. So, someone who moves every day, they may improve their ranch faster, but they've got a lot more time invested in it too. Someone who moves once or twice a week, they'll achieve the same results. It may just take them a little bit longer, but still yet there's quality of life that's involved in all this as well.
Well, and I think about myself personally, we have a diversified operation. So they're with the farming and other businesses too. That's something else that we always take into consideration when we think through our grazing plan and breeding groups each summer.
Yeah, on our business of grazing course, we work a lot on a grazing plan, and that's one of the things we put in there. We draw a line on the grazing plan and said, this, we're going to start calving here, and we're going to stop calving here, and I want to go on vacation with my family, and we put that in there. And we do all this just as you said. That way, that helps us plan those rotations and our grazing movements. And unfortunately, ranching is a great life, but it doesn't always go the way we plan it out on paper. So, but by having that grazing plan, that allows us to be more adaptive in our management, and we can make movements earlier. We talk planning a lot and being very adaptive, because that's regenerative ranching, and grazing is adaptive grazing. It's not a set in stone dynamic plan.
So when you are teaching those courses and helping ranchers create those grazing plans or modify existing ones, what are some other common mistakes that you help people work through or see, or maybe it's not a mistake so much as a missed opportunity?
That varies from course to course and participants, and that's one of the reasons I love doing what we do, is because I get an opportunity to talk to these people, understand their particular situations a little bit better. I was talking to one gentleman, and he realized that he was probably overstocked. He was a purebred breeder, and he thought, well, I'll plant this crop that I can graze it. And I told him, I said, well, that's good. At least you're doing something for the soil that way. But all you're really doing is replacing one feeding for a different type of feeding that you're spending money on. Don't get me wrong. I mean, bale grazing, feeding, there's nothing wrong with feeding hay. I've got plans to do it on our place this year. I've got some areas where the soil's not where I'd like to be, and I'd like to put a little cover on it. So I'm going to do what we call bale graze there and roll some hay out and allow my animals to get there, get around it and eat. I do not plan on letting them eat that hay to the ground. I'm going to leave a lot of it behind, just to kind of put some cover on that soil. So those are just different types of opportunities we get. And I talked to one lady who had a very sizable ranch, and she was wanting to know how to put infrastructure in this one pasture, and it was rather large. And I said, same way I do it on my 140 acres. I develop a plan, and I implement that plan when and as I can, slow and easy. Anytime we start making ranching too hard, it becomes unfun quickly.
Slow and easy. So you recommend producers kind of ease into it a lot of times as they make those changes? Or, I mean, that can be case by case too, I know, but.
Case by case is, but typically when we're talking to producers that are ranching and farming a little bit more conventionally, we ask them to just get a set of land, whether it's 10 or 50 or 100 acres, whatever, and start there on that. Concentrate on improving that one. We typically are going to ask them to start with their better land to do that with. And if there's things they want to try on some other spots, that's fine, but put their concentration and their focus on this one little spot. And then as they get more adaptive and more adjusted to looking and seeing what they're seeing and understanding what they're seeing, and they start seeing these improvements, then that gives them the energy to go to, to expand on out to the rest of their land. That's kind of what me and my wife did at our place. When it comes to infrastructure, I say a little at a time, because infrastructure is not cheap. Anytime you build any fence or lay a water line or dig a well, there's some dollars involved in there, and you need to calculate that out and make certain you can still cash flow, or where the money's going to come from. Can you afford it? What's it going to do for you? What's the return on investment going to be? How long is it going to take to pay off? I mean, there's all kinds of considerations, especially when you start spending money on your ranch.
For producers who are overstocked, but maybe fighting that concept of change and how to start and where to start, what are some questions you recommend they ask themselves?
Are they over carrying capacity? If they're over carrying capacity, can they reduce the size of their herd? And if the answer is yes to that, I mean, you obviously anybody can reduce their size of the herd, but they have to be willing to do that. I know a lot of purebred breeders, and they say it's my genetics that make me profitable, and I will argue with them. It's the decisions that they made choosing those genetics that made those genetics profitable in their mind. Genetics has nothing to do with it. It's the choices they made in choosing those genetics. So, if we are overstocked, my first recommendation is to start, getting rid of those unproductive, if we're straight cow-calf, getting rid of those unproductive cows. If we have multiple enterprises, maybe we're running goats or sheep or stockers or cow-calf, whatever enterprises we got, evaluate each one of those enterprises to make certain they're all profitable, and then choose the mix of enterprises that's going to make us the most money and that we want to mess with, and use those enterprises moving forward. Getting the carrying capacity right and setting stock density appropriately, because quite often what happens down here is, everybody's dependent upon that spring rain, and then when we don't get that spring rain and we go dry, we're not going to grow as much forage, and now all of a sudden we've got to sell cows. And if you want to talk about an emotional decision, that's when you decide you have to sell cows in a drought. Which cows are you going to sell? That becomes very emotional to a lot of people. So, if you set your carrying capacity set your stocking rate below carrying capacity, then you automatically got a little bit of a buffer in those years that's dry. You may not have to destock at all. You may be able to not destock as much, take out fewer animals. Those years where we get adequate rain or a lot of rain and we've got a whole lot of forage, and you're sitting there thinking, I've got all this forage, what can I do with it? I don't have enough cows. Well, there's opportunities there. We can bring in a set of yearlings and graze in there. We may be able to bring in some cows that we contract graze on our place. Maybe there's some areas we wanted to do some land improvements, and maybe we're going to set aside some land that we've always wanted to burn but just didn't have the forage. So, those gives you opportunities that way.
All right. Well, as people go ahead and think about our conversation today, if they want to dive deeper into this or get more information, what resources should they go to, or do you recommend?
They can always go to our website. It's ennoble.org. There's some articles. There's a list of our classes that they could attend if they want to do that. I know we've got several coming up in several different states pretty quickly. There's all kinds of other groups that are out there, podcasts such as yourself, YouTube channels, different things like that. The regenerative ranching movement is becoming more mainstay, I believe. So there's opportunities everywhere to look for information.
All right. Well, I really appreciate our conversation today and your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise. For those of you who are listening, you can find the link to the Noble website in the show notes. It's under that description there. It'll be easy for you to find there. And with that, happy ranching, folks.